I can record it on mine as well and send it to you if you want.
Okay.
Oh, it's place to do too. Turn the volume off, because that is ringing and ringing as well. No, mine doesn't want to load. We'll just have to go back on.
Okay, so what is it that you specialise in?
So my specialist areas are homicide and violent crime, particularly around gender. So I look at domestic abuse, domestic homicide, cases where men are convicted or accused of abusing or killing their partners.
Okay. So do you know anything about the rape laws?
Yes, so I know that the rape laws are very specific in terms of the parts of the anatomy that are described. The perpetrator can only be of male sex, and the the victim could either be of male or female sex. So it is an inherently gendered offence. It's not a neutral offence at all, and that's quite interesting because a lot of English and Welsh law is very neutral. I mean, even the new coercive control law is a gender neutral offence. So for this not to be is quite interesting.
So, in your opinion, do you think it's possible for a woman to rape a man?
I think in terms of the terminology and the legal definitions, it's not possible if we're being really pernickety and going by the actual wording of the legislation. But I think it is possible for a woman to sexually assault a man, and we're seeing increasing numbers of these cases come to light recently in terms of particularly male celebrities who are having selfies taken with fans, female fans, and those female fans are actually sexually assaulting them. There's unwanted touching going on and all kinds of things that if the gender dynamic was reversed, it would be a very different story. So I think that there are circumstances in which women sexually assault men, and I'm not quite sure that the law or society is ready to acknowledge that.
So, how would you define rape?
In terms of how I would define rape, I'd define it as God, that's a really interesting question. It is basically the imposition of the will to sexual intercourse on somebody who does not want to engage with it. And I think my definition doesn't actually include any gender or any sex sort of specific characteristics of the offender or the victim in there, but it is that imposition of your will, of your power on another individual who doesn't want to engage in that but feels coerced or compelled to.
Okay. So the Sexual Offences Act says that rape is penile penetration without consent. Do you think that this needs to change?
I think the definition perhaps does need to change to acknowledge that actually this isn't just a male or female crime. This is something that happens in different gender combinations, and I think the law is always playing catch up. But changes in the law are quite instrumental in terms of changes in social attitudes. So we often find that you have to have a change in the law to bring about a change in the way people think about a crime or think about a harm. So that relates to the coercive control law that came in 2015. So that started a conversation about it. There's an awareness that's growing around it now, and I think without that change in the law, we wouldn't have forced people to start actually talking about it. So I think the change in the law does need to come before the societal attitudes will change.
So do you think the way the law handles male rape is suggesting to people that it's a less serious crime than females?
Yeah, I think the fact that there is no legal provision for that actual act itself does send out a message about whether or not it's a crime. And I think we have to be really critical of legally defined crime, because a crime is only a crime when somebody decides that it is. It hasn't always been a crime, it might not always be a crime, and you've got to look at the groups of people in society who are in a powerful position to actually impose that label. And I think from a criminological perspective, we perhaps need to be thinking in terms of harm as well as crime. So not just looking at what we have on the statute books, but looking at the actual impact on the victims, and where there is a harm, we need to make sure that the law is reflecting that.
Mm-hmm. So do you think along those lines, do you think they need to recognise the damage more on males as well as females?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that there is a tendency to take this hyper-masculine stereotype about men in terms of they are the powerful ones, they're the dominant ones in society, and that's a very, very entrenched stereotype given centuries of patriarchy, essentially. But the amount of change that we've seen in the last 50 years has been really significant in terms of equal rights for women, in terms of that making its way into policy, making its way into everyday life. But I think at the same time, we have kind of neglected the idea of men and masculinities. So we focused a lot of our efforts on changes to benefit women, but at the same time, I don't think we've really thought about the impact of those changes on men. So I think we do need to bring those two things together.
Mm-hmm. So do you think this law has a negative effect on men or women, and if so, what is it?
I think that there is potentially a negative effect because it's denying that women can perpetrate this offence, and it denies men's victimhood, essentially. So when you look at situations where a man is being coercively controlled by a woman, the sexual element of that can be something that is present, but because there's no provision in the law for it at the moment, we're kind of dependent upon other offences to encompass it. And I think men feel actually quite reluctant to report these kind of offences to police. They feel reluctant to even acknowledge that they happened in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of questions we have to ask around masculinity, what our expectations are of men, especially around men's vulnerability and men's victimisation. So that's something we need to get to grips with.
Do you think this law will ever change?
In terms of whether the rape law will ever change, I think it does need to change, but I also think that we need to look at our attitudes around this offence in order to make sure that any changes we make are effective, because we know that the law as it stands at the moment isn't particularly effective in convicting male perpetrators. So we know that the conviction rate for rape is incredibly low. Mm-hmm. If you take the number of women who make complaints of rape to the police, the number of those that result in an actual conviction is incredibly low. So I think if we were to just expand that to include men, we'd see similar problems. Mm-hmm. Because of the burden of evidence and all of that type of stuff. So I think we need a look at the whole offence itself.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, fabulous.